the way esports is presented, both in traditional media and at times when certain political topics arise within the esports media. Because esports is typically only presented in a fashion which ties into narratives about it having a problem with misogyny, largely due to people directing insults towards what are clearly female players on the basis of their sex or using gendered insults. It's presented as having an issue with representation, primarily featuring females, women. Now, that's in itself, I think, a fairly pathetic and manipulative context purely towards political ends, but that's a separate discussion. But this is due to the fact that we don't have many high-level commentators, analysts, journalists, and so on who are female. Likewise, when it comes to top professional players in esports, especially in terms of earnings is the way it's typically presented, there aren't many who are female if you're going to make a list of the top 100 earners, top 50 earners. But I want to change the paradigm for a second, because all of those problems are problems someone else creates, says is a problem, and then typically presents what is their solution, which generally ties into their political philosophy and changes they want to see in the world. So here's the problem. Here's the paradigm shift I want to give you, because esports doesn't exist in a vacuum. And this is the key context that is missing from all of those narratives. Because if all those narratives, let's say we accepted the premise, but then we looked at all other big major sports, you would find every other sport not only fails in practically all of those categories, but significantly more so than esports. So the side that is almost never shown, publicized, promoted, celebrated about esports is that when you take away all those narratives, all those societal constructs, paradigms created by others and laid over like a grid across esports to divide it up along these political intersectional lines, esports is the most inclusive, most equal in terms of treating people identically, no matter who they are, sport or hobby imaginable in terms of the context of big televised sports that lots of people competing, there's a lot of money and people aspire to have a career around them and have big spectator focus. Now, I know already someone might say, wait a minute, surely chess is, because in chess you take away all the physical differences that are observable between males and females in different species, and particularly obviously the human race, Homo sapiens, and you just have the mental aspect, right? But I would actually argue that's the reason why it surpasses even chess, because chess is so focused purely within the mental capabilities that it skews and funnels the talents required and the skill sets rewarded even more so towards domains that have traditionally, historically, been the strengths of men, especially in terms of personality traits. Although I will say, if you look up the story of the Polgar girls, they are a possible exception within the chess world that's certainly worth exploring, but currently is just an interesting diversion that no one's really gone down far enough. Esports, on the other hand, the majority of them, I'm not really counting stuff like Hearthstone, the majority of them consist of a mechanical component, a strategical component, composure, etc. It's not about just one or the other. It's a blend of the mental and the physical, but not too extreme in either sense. So it's not physical in terms of strength or in terms of physical ability of your body to run or to jump or to lift heavy things. So in theory, it's not a problem in terms of the physicality, what your sex or gender is. I mean, we see male players who succeed at the top level, sometimes to the ultimate degree, who aren't the most mechanically skilled. We see male players who succeed to the nth degree, who aren't the smartest, who don't have the best mental capabilities, the best tactics, or the best strategical components. It's such a blend of each that you have to run the gamut and have some of each and the right mixture of them to succeed. It's not just about certain aspects which could be considered genetic necessarily. Then you've got to throw in, if you hide your identity and mask your audio in a game that requires communication, something that absolutely can be done on the hobby level before being a top professional where your identity will be revealed, you will categorically be treated identically to a man, to a male, because the other people playing will not know that you are not a male. They will just assume you are All signs will seem as much, and therefore you'll be treated as a man. Something no woman who is noticeably female could experience in a sport that requires you to be physically present. Even something like chess. They would react differently to you, whether in a sexist manner or not. They would simply treat you in a way that was not equal. Now, in that scenario, I would say, in certain contexts, why should they treat you equally? You're different. You are a different sex, or in different contexts, different race, whatever it might be. They're going to come into it with preconceptions, or they might even treat you in a different way to be more polite to you, especially if you are someone who is a minority to the typical representation made up in gaming. You know, in those contexts it is. But if you want a purely equal sport, this is the one for you in that sense. Because in the context where people don't know your identity and they don't know that you're female or whatever you may be, they don't care. They just care that you're good or that they enjoy playing with you. Now, if you get good enough that you can now compare your skills to the very best players in the world, who at this point in time are overwhelmingly male, as it happens, then a point, and this is actually an epiphany that I came to, which helped me inform this entire concept behind this video, which was in a show on YouTube you read called Good Game. And it was in episode 1. That's a show that was in part produced by Michelle Morrow, who you might have seen on E-League and BlizzCon and a bunch of different esports tournaments of I think Heroes of the Dawn, perhaps. I might be incorrect on that one. And in this episode, these people are gathering together a bunch of gamers. It's got a casual appeal to it. And they're trying to get a bunch of people to compete in esports. And one of the people they go to is a girl who's a black athlete. She's a tennis player and she's trying to get back into tennis, coming back from an injury. And what they basically tell her is, you know, the gist is like the best you can do in tennis is be the best woman. And people will always say like, you know, you're the best woman. You don't compete against the men. You'll never get to test your skills against the men. But in the esports domain, you can test your skills against everyone who plays the esport. So you'll know how good you are. And I thought to myself, even though it's just a throwaway little concept thrown in there as a way of convincing this girl, that's not sophistry. That's actually accurate. That's based on principles that exist and it's logically sound. And yet that's never played up. It actually is the most egalitarian, most empowering sport that you can have for anyone of any race, sex, gender, socioeconomic background. Because that's the thing. In something like tennis, a big sport with lots of money in it, okay, you only compete against women if you are female. So Serena Williams is the woman who has won the most Grand Slams in history. She has won 23 Grand Slams. But she will never be given the same credit or called the best tennis player of all time, because even though Roger Federer has only won 18 Grand Slams, he did it all against men who have been the better players throughout history. So because she didn't compete against him, and because she wasn't playing the exact same sport, her 23 can't supersede his 18 and practically never will. And even if it turns out, let's say she was better, which, I mean, all evidence suggests otherwise, but let's say she was better. We'll never know that, and she could never get the appropriate credit, and she'll never truly know that herself, because she didn't compete against all the men and just everyone, all women, all men, every type of person. So, with good reason. Now, in practically any big spectator sport, this is the case. European soccer, American football, ice hockey, basketball. Women do not compete against men at the top level in these sports. Unlike esports, there is no question in those sports of representation of female pro players or equality between them or inclusion of other sexes or genders within these the top end of the sports, which tends to be the males. There's no question of that. It's not even that they've got a problem. They're just black and white. There's males and there's females, and those are kept apart, and ne'er the two shall meet. The fact is, then you've also got to add in, because a great deal of esports competition, up to the point you become a top, like 1% or less pro, is online, also removes another component that, for example, in team-based games, you now don't have certain physical sexual harassment components, which can be a factor within real sports, or within the fact that people will say like the locker room environment's different, or, you know, how would we like room and people see me naked in a show. You don't have to have any of those problems. You don't even have to overcome any of those issues or change any minds or shatter any paradigms. It's not a problem. You log on the server the same as everyone else. You go in the voice chat the same as everyone else. You come in the game the same as everyone else. You play the game the same as everyone else. After that, you go away. We've actually even transcended some of the intangible seemingly elements, some of the behind the scenes environmental elements of sexism that you'll probably never be able to overcome due to the fact that these are different people from different backgrounds trying to compete together or against each other. So then you've got to add in another aspect, which I think is amazing if you think about it, actually, that again is never played up, is never celebrated, is never shouted about. But it's amazing when you consider how big esports is getting that we are ahead of traditional sports in this sense. Esports is one of the only sports, by the way, when I say sports, I'm putting it in the category of that. I'm not saying it is a sport necessarily, but it's treated as such, and it shares enough overlap that it's worth putting it in this context for this discussion. It is one of the only sports I have ever seen to reach a big level which has not only transcended any concepts or problems to do with sex or gender, but done so without any political hurdles to be battled against in terms of rights or activism. There have been numerous transgender individuals in games from StarCraft to League of Legends to fighting games who have not only succeeded in competing on the circuit with the other top players who are men, but also in accomplishing notable victories, in winning trophies. And there has never been a huge community backlash to keep these people out. There were never rules barring them from competing in the first place. There was never debate over whether or not, because they're a different sex or gender, or they've changed to a different one, should they be allowed to compete, or should they be made to play with women or with men? Since these are wide open sports where everyone can compete at the top level, it's not men's esports, that's just the top level of esports. You have to actively choose to opt out of men's esports in order to focus on women's esports, which is an exhibition circuit based around a separate set of marketing. It's not the traditional stream of esports. Because of this, this has never been an issue. Yet is this lauded? Is this celebrated? No. In fact, in a sense, esports has been a victim of its own success in that respect. Because we are so inclusive and because it is so rarely mentioned that these individuals were transgender, this doesn't even bleed through into write-ups within esports, and therefore it doesn't bleed through into mainstream acknowledgement. And so this is never something mentioned as a good factor, along with all these negative narratives that are artificially created about esports, that we have transcended sex and gender in a way no physical sport has or probably ever will, quite frankly. Because when you contrast it with the physical sports, some of the ones I talked about before, they have currently got a real Gordian knot to figure out when it comes to integrating transgender athletes. What do they do with that? Do they compete with males if they are female to male? Do they compete with women if they are male to female? Should there be some separate division entirely for all of them if we're going to segregate people? No one knows what the solution is, right, quite frankly, at the moment. And at the moment, they're going case by case, and it's fairly arbitrary, and there's no real consistency as to what the results end up being. So you've seen scenarios where in female sports, male to female transgender people, it's being claimed, they shouldn't be allowed to compete. They're getting an advantage because they naturally have testosterone or certain physical capabilities, which in terms of averages over the sex groups, men tend to have an advantage in certain physical sports. And they say, see, they shouldn't be allowed to compete against females. But then the problem obviously is if they're taking drugs and they've had physical transition, they're also not going to necessarily be equipped the same way to compete with men. And they also now consider themselves female. So isn't that awkward? Isn't this going to be a problem for them? No one's really solved the problem on that one. It actually goes the other way as well. Because what people don't know is, yes, most high-profile incidences in physical sports, as in esports, have been male to female transgender individuals. But there's actually been a couple I saw. I saw one story, I believe it was an individual who was transitioning from being female to male, and I believe they were competing in, I think, high school or college level wrestling, and even they were under scrutiny over whether they should be allowed to compete with males. Now, in that sports setting, you might initially think that doesn't make sense, because in theory, right, males are considered, especially in a sport like wrestling, stronger, faster, etc. So you would think, why can't this person compete? Well, first of all, they could lay the grounds of, maybe it's too dangerous to allow them to compete since they don't have the natural advantages. But more importantly, the main issue people had a problem with is that obviously physical transition typically takes the form of having to use drugs, and these include hormones, for example. So in this particular case, the fact that this person who was going from female to male was taking, I would assume, some form of testosterone. Well, the problem is a male competing in that same male sport who was found to be taking additional testosterone would be considered to be using a performance-enhancing drug. So that was grounds on which are even going the other way. The way that seems less controversial had a big lot of controversy around it, and there was no real right or wrong answer, because again, these are different individuals, and you're trying to integrate them all into one sport and figure out what is fair, what is responsible for us to allow people to do. Where do we draw the line here on what the context of accomplishments might be in these particular senses? No one's really solved these problems because they're not simple to solve. They probably require very complex solutions, and these are such rare instances currently that it's been a real problem. Esports hasn't had that. We've breezed right past it. It came along. It was never an issue. People just became aware that transgender people competed, and they just immediately were welcomed in, had success, because again, no one cares what sex or gender you are in theory. And they succeeded and have become champions, have made salaries, made careers, won hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's even written up that a woman has won this big StarCraft tournament, even if they happen to have been someone who transitioned from male to female. It's never mentioned. So in a sense, the inclusivity of esports is sometimes used against it because it's never given credit for that. Then you've got to consider as well, forget just sex or race or whatever it might be. Even socio-economic background does not matter in a way that isn't the case for other sports, especially in the modern era. Because in the modern era, in a game like CSGO, we've seen that if you become very good in FPL, where the pros play, so players like ROPS, players like VeXii, you can get into top teams no matter where you're from. They're from Estonia, Turkey, not countries traditionally with a lot of success in Counter-Strike, or some background or heritage and legacy of greatness where you'd pick up players, but they've been able to get onto top teams. You have MMR in Dota 2, where we've seen players like Sumail, Weeha, all these sorts of players be given a shot at the top level because they were so high on the ladder. Again, even if they come, some of them, not from traditional backgrounds. You have solo queue for League of Legends. Again, you can work your way up. You can prove yourself before anyone need know what country you're from or that even become a factor. Then you've got to add in, as long as basically the only limitations are, as long as you've got a computer that's good enough to run the game so it doesn't inhibit your skills, and you've got a good enough internet connection that you don't have too high a ping so it again inhibits your skills, that's all you need to play at a high enough level that you can get a chance at the pro level. You don't need a parent who has the time to drive you around or the resources to pay for you to take part in a sport or training. You don't need to get into a specific program, which is going to be your only chance to get to compete in certain lower level amateur leagues and then make it. Or meet the right coach who can take you up through the system or show you the ropes. You don't need to live in the right country to have a special local scene or chances to prove yourself. It's something of a global sport. Internet connections are good enough within continents. You can compete wherever you're from. With the exception, basically, of the African continent, every continent currently in esports is basically able to compete and play and have a chance at not just becoming pro, but the highest level of pros. So, for example, one that used to have a big problem was Australasia. Australians were stuck in their own little local scene. There was no real way to prove yourself. You had the odd one tournament a year maybe you could attend. Now we have Australians who've proven themselves and they've been flown over. They compete in North America now, with some of the best teams and go to all the big tournaments, compete in all the big leagues. Again, except for Africa, which currently obviously has its own technological limitations. There is no limitation globally or in terms of background. And like I say, social and economic background. Obviously, you don't even need to actually have a PC and a connection. As long as you can get enough, scrape by enough to go to an internet cafe and play for a few hours a week, you could also make it in theory. Now, in elucidating some of this and going into some of the context and the details, especially, as I said, not in a vacuum, but contrasted against traditional sports, it really exposes the media narrative internally and externally surrounding esports. Because the problem is, externally, esports is something new that these old media, traditional media, don't understand. And to the extent that they do understand it, they see it as a threat. They see it as alternative culture, alternative media, a potential replacement for themselves, for television, for traditional mainstream culture. Hence, they are hostile to it. They try to downplay it, to misrepresent it, to overplay and oversell negative aspects of it as being crippling problems, when actually we are ahead of every other sport in those particular contexts, and in some senses, light years ahead. In fact, in some senses, perhaps ahead in a way you could never be in other sports because of the different nature, the digital nature of the competition, even if you're an offline component. And hence, you don't see these people in the mainstream media playing up this incredible and unique side to this sport and this hobby. And this goes the same for media within esports. This is barely ever mentioned. People don't even think this way. This video, actually, I think it's one of the first times I've ever heard it put this way in such a comprehensive manner. So this is the thing with esports. Here's why it is the most inclusive, the most equal sport ever, and probably that will ever exist. Because in esports, it doesn't matter how high you can jump. It doesn't matter how fast you can run. It doesn't matter how much weight you can lift, how strong your grip is, how intelligent you necessarily are, how rich you are, where you come from, or what reproductive organs are between your legs. It just matters how well you can play.
I'm Kelsey Moser from Yahoo Esports, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel, where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.
This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Twitch, Sanity, Gman, HawpT, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, VeXii, Kevin HawpT, Jason A, and Travis G. Greb. Want to suggest a guest to appear on my show or a topic to discuss? Perhaps you'd like to ask me a question. In 2018, for the first time in history, you can directly influence and support my content with the Patreon link below. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today.